Part 3, Changing Traditions. The three order, changing culture traditions. Changing traditions. We have seen how by the 9th century, large part of the Asia witnessed the growth and expansion of great empires, some nomadic, some based on the well-developed cities and trading networks that centered on them. The difference between the Macedonia, Roman, Arab Empire and the ones that preceded them, the Egyptian, Assyrian, Chinese, Mauryan, was that they covered greater part of the area of territory and were continental or transcontinental in nature. The Mongol Empire was similar. Different culture encounters were crucial to what took place. The arrival of empires was almost always sudden, but they were almost always the result of changes that had been taking place over a long time in the core of what would become an empire. Tradition in the world history could change in different ways. In Western Europe during the period from the 19th to 17th century, much that we connect with the modern times evolved slowly and the development of scientific knowledge based on the experiment rather than religious belief. Serious thought about the organization of government was with attention to the creation of the civil services, parliament and the different codes of law, improvement in the technology that was used in the industry and agriculture. The consequences of these changes could be felt with great force outside Europe. As we have seen, by the 5th century, the Roman in the West was disintegrated. In Western, the Central Europe and the remaining of the Roman Empire was slowly adapted to the administrative requirement and needs of tribal that was established kingdom there. However, urban centers was smaller in the Western Europe than further east. By 19th century, the commercial and the urban centers, Aix, London, Rome, Siena, through small could not be diminished. From the 19th to the 11th century, there were major development in the countryside in Western Europe. The church and the royal government development, a combination of Roman institution with the customary rules of tribe. The finest example was the Emperor of Charles Mange in the Western and the Central Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. Even after its rapid expansion, urban centers and trading networks persisted, albeit under heavy attack from the Hungarians, Vikings and others. What happened was called feudalism. Feudalism was marked by the agriculture production around castle and the manor houses, where lords of the manor possessed land that was cultivated by peasants, serfs, who pledged them loyalty, goods and services. These lords are turned pledged their loyalty to the greater lords who were vassals of king. The Catholic Church, center on the papacy, supported this state of affairs and itself possessed land. In a world where uncertainties of life, poor sense of medicine and low life expectancy were common, the church showed people how to behave so that life after death at least would be tolerable. Monasteries were created where the God-fearing peoples could devote themselves to the service of God in the way Catholic churchmen throughout fit. Equally, church were the part of the network of scholarship that ran from the Muslim states of Spain to Byzantium, and they provided the petty kings of Europe with the sense of the opulence of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The influence of the commerce and towns in the feudal order came to evolve and change, encouraged by the Mediterranean entrepreneurs in Venice and Genoa. From the 12th century, their ships carried on the growing trade with the Muslim states with the remain of the Roman Empire in the east. Attacked by the lure of wealth in these areas and inspired by the idea of freezing holy places associated with the Christ from Muslim Europe, kings reinforced link across the Mediterranean during the Crusades. Crusades means the Dharmyud. The trade within Europe improved, centered on the fairs and the port cities of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, and stimulated by a growing population. The place of the popes in Avignon, a 14th century town in the South France. The place of the Doge in Vienne, 15th century. Opportunities for commercial expansion coincided with the changing attitudes concerned in the value of life. Respect for human beings and the living things that marked much for Islamic art and literature, and the example of Greek art and ideas that came into Europe from Byzantine trade encouraged Europe to take a new look at the world. And from the 14th century, in what is called the Renaissance, especially in the North Italian town, the wealthy becomes the less concerned with the life after death and the more with the wonders of life itself. Sculptors, painters and writers became interested in the humanity and discover of the world. By the end of the 15th century, the state of affairs encouraged travel and discovered as never before. Voyages of the discovery took place. Spaniards and Portuguese who had traded with the North Africa pushed further down the coast of Western Africa, finally leading to the journeys around the Cape of Good Hope to India, which had a great reputation in Europe as the source of spices that were a great demand. Columbus attended to the find a western route to India, and in 1492 reached the islands which the Europe called the West Indies. Cuba and the Antilles Islands are called West Indies, and the other parts, some South American islands are also. Other explorers tried to find the northern route to India and China via the Arctic. European travelers encountered a range of different peoples in the course of their journeys. In part, they were interested in learning from them. The Papacy encouraged the work of the North African geographer and the traveler Hassan al-Waza, later known as the Europe as the Leo Africanus, who wrote the first geography of Africa in the early 16th century for Pope Leo X. Jesuit churchmen observed and wrote on Japan in the 16th century. An Englishman, Will Adams, became a friend and counselor of the Japanese shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu in the early 17th century. As in the case of the Hassan al-Wasa, peoples that the Europe encountered in the America often took a great interest in them and sometimes worked for them. For example, an Aztec woman, later known as the Dona Marina, befriended the Spanish conqueror of Mexico, Cortes, and interpreted and negotiated for him. In their encounters, Europeans were sometimes cautious, self-effacing, and observant, even as the frequency attempted to establish trade monopoly and enforce their authority by the force of arms, as the Portuguese attempted to do in the Indian Ocean after Vasco da Gama arrival in the Calicut, present-day Kozhikode, in 1498. In other cases, there were the overbearing, aggressive, and the cruel adopt an attitude on the superiority of those they met. Considered such peoples ignorant, the Catholic Church encouraged both attitudes. The Church was centered for the study of the other cultural and the languages, but encouraged attack on the people it saw as the unchristians. From the point of view of non-Europeans, the encounter with the Europe varied. For much of the Islamic land and the India and China through Europeans remained a curiosity until the end of the 17th century. They were perceived as a hardy trade and the seamen who had little to contribute to their sense of the large world. The Japanese learnt some of the advantage of European technology quickly. For instance, they had begun large-scale production of the muskets by the late 16th century. In Americas, enemies of the Aztec Empire sometimes used Europeans to challenge the power of the Aztecs. At the same time, the diseases the Europe brought devastated the population, leading to death over 90% population of the peoples in some areas by the end of the 16th century. The Spaniards brought disease, the Europeans brought disease to Aztec, which are the central to lower North American civilization. Aztec and Maya both are finished by the Europeans due to the diseases caused by them. 90% population got finished, and others were attacked by the Spaniards. Penny asked. Time period. 3. The period under consideration witnessed several major developments in the Europe, including changes in the agriculture and the lives of the peasants. It was also marked by a large number of cultural development. This timeline draw attention to contradictions between the continents, stimulated in the many instances by the growth of trade. The impact of these contracts was varied, while idea, invention, and goods were shared across continents. There was also constant warfare between kingdoms to control land, resources, and access to the trade routes. As a result, men and women were often displaced and the enslaved, if not exterminated. In many ways, the lives of the people were transformed beyond recognition. From 1300, it is always Anno Domini, which is now known as Common Era, between 1300 to 25. In Europe, Alhambra and the Granada emerged as the important culture center in Spain. In 1325 to 50, plague in Egypt. 1348 to 55, plague in Egypt. 100 in Europe, 100 years war between England and France. 1337 to 1457, Black Death, a form of plague, spread throughout the Europe. Black Death is a form of plague which spread throughout the Europe. 1350 to 75, Ibn Battuta explored the Sahara. Ibn Battuta was a Moroccan traveler who came into India on the ruling of the Muhammad bin Tughlaq. French peasants protest against the high taxes in 1358 in Europe. 1375 in Africa, same plague. The peasants revolt in the Britain. 1381, Geoffrey Chaucer's write the Canterbury Tales, one of the earliest composition in the English. 1388, between 4025 to 50, Portuguese began slave trading. Portuguese started slave trading between 4050 to 75. Shanghai Empire in the West Africa established based on the trading network across the Sahara. Portuguese expedition and the settlement along the west coast of Africa, 1471 onwards. After the first printed book appears in the Europe, Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, painter, architect, inventor in Italy. Between 1475 to 1500, Portuguese converted the king of the Boconga to Christianity. Establishment of the Tudor dynasty in the England in 1485. 1500 to 1525, African slaves taken to work on the sugar plantation in America. African slaves which is go into sugar plantation, the region which is under control of British Empire. They go into Africa, the East India Company, and there was a West India Company, West Indies Company. So they controlled some regions of some colonies of the America, not whole America, some colonies of Africa. So the African slaves imported from that and go into America, and they work on the sugar plantations. Ottoman Turks conquer Egypt. In Europe, coffee from the South America is drunk in the Europe for the first time. 1517, and the tobacco, chocolate, tomatoes, and the turkey are also introduced. Martin Luther attempted to reform the Catholic Church in 1517 in Europe. 1525 to 1550, Copernicus propounded the theory about the solar system, that three laws is given by solar system is discovered by Copernicus, but the three laws of revolutions is given by the Kepler. 1550 and to 75, William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, dramatic in England. 1575 to 1600, Zacharias Janssen invented the microscope in 1590s. 1600 to 25, Oyo, kingdom of the Nigeria at the height of its power, centers for metal working. In Europe, one of the first novel, Don Quixote, written in the Spanish in 1605. Between 1625 to 50, in Europe, William Harvey demonstrated that blood is pumped through the body by the heart. In 1628, William Harvey, who discovered the blood group, is William Harvey. 1650 to 75, Portuguese destroyed the Congo Kingdom in 1662, and in Europe, Louis XIV, King of the France between 1638 to 1715. Between 1775 to 1700 in Europe, Peter the Great between 1682 to 1725 attempted to modernize Russia. Now we can see comparison between Asia and the South Africa, what is changes going on from the 13th century to 1700. In Asia between 1300 to 25, nothing as evidence we have. In 1325 to 1350, establishment of Vijayanagar Empire in the south of India, Vijayanagar Empire by the Harrier Buka. This empire is established under the region of the Muhammad bin Tughlaq. 1750 to 75, Ming dynasty in China between 1368 to onward. 1375 Ming dynasty continuous, and between 1400 to 1425 emergence of the regional sultanates in South Asia. South Asia is basically focused on India. In 1450 to 75, Ottoman Turks capture Constantinople. Constantinople is now the region of the Istanbul is called Constantinople. Between 1475 to 1500, Vasco da Gama reaches India in 1498 on the Calicut, which is received by the Zamorin. The Portuguese set up first his factory on the Calicut. 1500 to 25, Portuguese enter into China, opposed driven out to Macau. In 1422, Macau is the casino of Asia. 1525 to 1550, Babur established Mughal control over North India. First battle of Panipat in 1526, in which he defeated the Ibrahim Lodi, which is the dynasty of Lodi dynasty, who defeated and established of Mughal Empire on the North India. 1550 to 75, Akbar. 1556 to 65, consolidated Mughal rule. Akbar on the second battle of Panipat between the Suri Empire and the Akbar, and Akbar established regained the control of regained the control of Delhi and re-established the Mughal Empire. Between 1575 to 1600, first Kabulki plague stayed in the Japan. Shah Abbas 1587-1629 of Persia introduces European method of military training. Between 1600 to 25, Tokugawa Shonteng established in Japan in 1603. In India, establishment of British East India Company in 1600. 1625 to 50, all European traders with the exception of the Dutch forbidden to trade with the Japan. 1637, Manchuju rule in China 1644 onwards, which last for the nearly 300 years. Growing demand in the Europe for the Chinese tea and silk. Basically, tea came from the China, and silk also came from the China. Construction of the Taj Mahal between 1632 to 53. What was the happening in the dates of 13th century to 17th century between Austria and America? This is the comparison between that. Aztec in America, Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan, in Mexico. 1325, building temples, development of irrigation system, and accounting system is Quipu, which is the accounting system of Aztec civilization. Between 1450 to 75, Incas established control over Peru. 1465, between 1470 to 1500, Columbus reaches the West Indies in 1492 on the search of America and the search of India. He reaches the West Indies. 1525 Spanish conquest of Mexico. In 1521 Magellan, a Spanish navigator, reaches the Pacific Ocean in 1519. 1525 to 50 French explorer reaches Canada in 1534. 1550 to 75 Spanish conquest of Peru in 1572. 1575 to 1600 Dutch sailor reaches Austria by accident. In 1600 to 1625 England set up its first colony in the North America. 1605 the first slaves are brought from the West Africa to Virginia in 1619. In Spanish sailors reaches Tahiti in Australia. 1625 to 50 Dutch found New Amsterdam, now control New York. 1626 first printing press is set up in Massachusetts in 1635. Dutch navigator Abel Tasman sailor around Austria without raising it. He then land on the Van Diemen Land, later called Tasmans. He also reaches New England but think it is part of the huge landmasses. 1650 to 75 first sugar plantations are established in the West Indies. 1654. 1675 to 17th century French colonized the Mississippi Basin, naming it the Louisiana after the King Louis XIV in 1682. Now our chapter is started, the three orders. In this chapter, we shall learn about the social, economic and the political changes which concerned in the Western Europe between the 19th and the 16th centuries. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many groups of the Germanic peoples from the Eastern and the Central Europe occupy the region of Italy, Spain and France. In the absence of any unifying political force, military conflict was the frequent, and the need to gather resources to protect one's land became very important. Social organization was therefore centered on the control of the land. Its feature was driven from the both imperial Roman tradition and German customs. Christianity, the official religion of the Roman Empire from the 4th century, survived the collapse of Rome and gradually spread to the Central and the North Europe. The church also became a major landholder and the political power in the Europe. The three orders, the focus of this chapter are three social categories: Christian, priest, land-owning nobles and peasants. The changing relationships between these three groups was an important factor in the shaping Europe history for several centuries. Over the last 100 years, European historians have done detailed work on the histories of region, even on the individual villages. This was possible because from the medieval period there is a lot of material in the form of document details of ownership, prices and legal cases. For example, churches kept records of birth, marriages and death, which have made it possible to understand the structure of families and of population. The inscription in the churches gave information about the traders, associations and song and stories gave a sense of festivals and the community activities. All these can be used by the historians to understand economic and social life and the changes over a long period time, like increase in population, or over a short period time like peasants revolt. Of the many scholars in the France who have worked on the feudalism, one of the earliest was Baloch. Marc Baloch 1886 to 1944 was one of a group of scholars who argued that history consists of much more than just political history, international relations and the lives of the great peoples. He emphasized the importance of the geography in the shaping human history and the need to understand collective behavioral attitudes of the group of peoples. Baloch feudal society is about the European, particularly French, associate between the 900 and 1300, describing in the remarkable details social relations and the inheritances land management and the popular culture of the period. His career was cut short tragically when he was shot by the Nazis in the Second World War. An introduction to feudalism. That the term medieval era, what is the term medieval era, refers to the period of European history between the 15th and the 5th to 15th century. Medieval era is means the term feudalism has been used by the historian to describe the economic, legal and political and the social relationships that exist in the Europe in the medieval era. Derived from the German word feudal, which means a piece of land. It refers to the kind of society that developed in the medieval France and later in the England and in the South Italy. In an economic sense, feudalism refers to a kind of agriculture production which is based on the relationship between lords and the peasants. The latter cultivated their lands as well as that of the lords. The peasants performed labor services for the lords, who in exchange provided military protection. They also have extensive judicial control over peasants. Thus, feudalism went beyond the economic to cover the social and political aspect of the life as well. Although its roots have been traced to practice that existed in the Roman Empire and during the age of the French king Charlemagne in 1742 to 1814. Feudalism is the established way of life in large part of Europe, may be said to have emerged later in the 11th century. France and England. Gaul, a province of the Roman Empire, had two extensive coastline, mountain ranges, long rivers, forest and large tract of plains suited to agriculture. The Franks, a German tribe, gave their name to Gaul, making it France. From the 6th century, this region was a kingdom ruled by the French king who were Christian. The French has very strong link with the church, which were further strengthened when in 1800 the Pope gave King Charlemagne the title of Holy Roman Emperor to ensure this support. Across a narrow support, which means the head of the Eastern Church in the Constantinople had a similar relation with the Byzantine Emperor. Across a narrow channel lay the island of the England, Scotland, which in the 11th century was conquered by a duke from the French province of Nomadics. Early history of France. In 1481, Clovis became king of Franks. In 1486, Clovis and the Franks began the conquest of the North Gaul. In 1496, Clovis and the Franks converted to Christianity. In 1714, Charles Martel became mayor of the palace. In 751, Martel's son Pepin deposes the Frankish ruler, became king and established a dynasty. Wars of the conquest doubled the size of his kingdom. In 1768, Pepin succeeded by his son Charles Magnan, Charles the Great. In 800, Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. In 840, raid by the Vikings from Norway. The three orders. French priests believed in the concept that peoples were members of the one of the third orders, depending upon their work. A bishop started here below some prayers, other fights, still other works. Thus, the three orders of the society were broadly the clergy, the nobility and the peasantry. In the 12th century, Abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote, "Who would think of the herding his entire cattle in one stable, cows, donkeys, sheep, goats without difference? Therefore, it is necessary to establish difference among human beings so that they do not destroy each other. God make distinctions among his folks in heaven as on earth. All are loved by him, yet there is no equality among them." Abi is derived, what is Abi? Abi is derived from the Syriac Abba, meaning father, and Abi was governed by an abbot or an abbess. Now we can go to the second order, the nobility. The priests placed themselves in the first order, the nobles in the second, and the nobility had in reality a central role in the social processes. This is because they controlled land. This control was the outcome of the practice called vassalage. The king of France were linked to the people by the vassalage, similarly to the practice among the Germanic peoples, by whom the Franks were one and the big landowners, the nobles, were vassals of the king. The peasants were vassals of the landowners. A noble accepted the king as his senior, and they made a mutual promise, and senior lord, driven from the word meaning of one provided beer, would be protect the vassals who would be loyal to him. This relationship involved the elaborate rituals and the exchange of vows taken on the Bible in a church. At this ceremony, the vassals receive a written character or a staff or even a cloth of earth as a symbol of the land that was being given to him by his master. The noble enjoy a privileged status. He had absolute control over his property. In the perpetuity, he could raise troops called feudal levies. The lord held his own courts of justice and could even coin his own money. He was the lord of all the people settled on his land. He owned vast tract of the land which contained his own dwellings, his private fields and the pastures, and the homes and the field of his tenant peasants. His houses were called a manor. His private lands were cultivated by peasants who were also accepted to act as the foot soldier in the battle when required. In addition to work on their own farms, the manorial estate, a lord had his own manor house. He also controlled villages. Some lords controlled hundreds of villages where peasants live. A small manorial estate could contain a dozen's family, while a large estate might include 50 or 60. Almost everything needed for daily life was found on the estate. Grain or growth in the field. Blacksmiths and carpenters maintained the lord's implements and they repaired his weapons, while a stonemasons looked after his buildings. Bowmen spun and wove fabric, and children's work in the lord and wine presses. The estate had extensively woodland, and the forest where the lord hunted. They contained it is the picture of the manorial estate, England, 13th century. Pastures where his cattle and his horses graze. There was a church on the estate and a castle for the defense. From the 13th century, some castles were made bigger or used as the residence for a knight's family. In fact, the king castles were practically unknown before the Norman conquest and developed as centers of political administration and the military power under the feudal system. The manor could not be completely self-sufficient because salt, milestone, and metalware had to be obtained from outside sources. Those landlords who wanted a luxurious lifestyle were kept to buy rich furnishing, musical instruments and ornaments not locally produced, had to get it from the other places. The knights. From the 9th century, there were frequent localized war in the Europe, and the amateur peasant soldiers were not sufficient, and the good cavalry was needed. This led to the growing importance of the new section of the people, the knights. They were linked to the lords just as the latter were linked to the king. The lord gave the knight a piece of land called fief and promised to protect it. The fief could be inherited. It extended to anything between 1,000 and 2,000 acres or more, including a house for the knight and his family, a church and other establishment to house his dependents, besides a watermill and a wine press. As in the feudal manor, the land of the fief was cultivated by peasants. In exchange, knight paid his lord a regular fee and promised to fight for him in war. To keep up their skills, knight spent each day fencing and the practicing tactics with the dummies. A knight might served more than one lord, but his foremost loyalty was his own hand. In France, from the 12th century, minstrel traveler from the manor to manor, singing song which told stories partially historical, partially invented, about brave king and knights. In an age when not too many people could read and the manuscripts were few, these traveling bards were very popular. Many manors had a narrow balcony above the large hall where the peoples of the manor gathered for meals. This was the ministerial gallery, from where singers entertained nobles while they feasted. The poem, in my dear lord is slain, his fate I will share. If he will hanged, then hang me by his side. If to go to stake in goes with him, I will burn. And if he is drowned, then let me drown with him. Written by De Marcy, a 13th century French poem to be sung. The first order, the clergy. The Catholic Church had its own laws on land given to it by the rulers and could levy taxes. It was thus a very powerful institution which did not depend on the king. At the head of the Western Church was the Pope. He lived in the Rome. The church in the Europe were guided by the bishops and the clergy, who constituted the first order. Most villages had their own church, where people assembled every Sunday to listen to the sermon by the priest and to pray together. Everyone could not become a priest. Serfs were banned, as were the physically challenged. Women could not become priests. Men who became priests could not marry. Bishops were the religious nobility. Like lords who owned vast landed estate, the bishops also had use of the vast estate and lived in the grand palaces. The church was entitled to the 10th share of whatever the peasants produced from their land over the course of the year, called a tithe. Money also became form of the endorsement made by the rich for their own welfare and the welfare of the deceased relatives in the afterlife. Some of the important ceremonies conducted by the church copied formal customs of the feudal elite. The act of the kneeling while praying, with hands clasped and the head bowed, was an explicit replica of the way in which the knight conducted himself by taking vow of royalty to his lord. Similarly, the use of term lord for the god was another example of feudal culture that was found into the places of the churches. Thus, the religious and the lay worlds of the feudal shares many customs and the symbols. Monks. Apart from the church, devout Christians had another kind of the organization. Some deeply religious people choose to live isolated lives, in the contrast of the cleric who lived among the people in town and villages. They lived in the religious communities called abbeys or monasteries. Often in the place is very far from human habitations. Two or more well-known monasteries were those established by the Saint Benedict in the Italy in 529 and the Cluny of the Bulgaria in 910. Monks took vows to remain in the abbey for the rest of their lives and to spend their time in prayer, study and the manual labor like farming, unlike priesthood. This life was open to both men and women. Men became monks and the women nuns. Except in a few cases, all abbeys were the single communities. That is, there were spartly abbeys for the men and women. Like priests, monks and the nuns did not marry. From small communities of 10 or 20 women, monasteries grew a communities often of the several hundred with the large buildings and the landed estates. With the attacked school or colleges and hospitals, they contributed to the development of the art. Abbeys had was gifted musician and did not to develop the practice of community singing or prayers in the church. From the 13th century, some groups of monks called friars choose not to be based on the monastery but to move from place to place preaching to the people and living on charity. The word monastery is derived from the Greek word monos, meaning someone who lives alone. This is St. Michael Benedictine Abbey in the Farnborough, England. In Benedictine monasteries, there was a manuscript with 73 chapters of rules which were followed by the monks for many centuries. Here are some of the rules they had to be followed. In chapter 6, the permission to speak should be rarely be granted to monks. In chapter 7, humility means obedience. In chapter 33, no monk should own private property. In chapter 47, idleness is the enemy of the soul. So, friaries and sisters could be occupied at certain times in manual labor and at fixed hour in sacred reading. In chapter 48, the monastery could be laid out in such a way that all the necessary to be found within its boundary. Water mill, garden and workshops. By the 14th century, there was a growing uncertainty about the values and the purpose of monasticism. In England, Langland poem Pierre Floman between 1360 to 70 contrasted the ease and the luxury of lives of the some monk with the pure faith of simple plowman and the shepherd and the poor common laborers. Also in England, Clochery wrote the Canterbury's Tales, see in the books, which had comic poets of the nun and the monk and a friary. The church and the society. Through Europeans became Christians, they still had to be some of old beliefs in the magic and the folk traditions. Christmas and Easter became important dates from the 14th century. Christ's birthday celebrated on the 25th December replaced and the old pre-Roman festival, the dates of the which was calculated by the solar calendar. Easter marked the crucifixion of the church and his rising from the dead, but its date was not fixed because it replaced and the older festival to celebrate the coming of the spring after a long winter, dated by the lunar calendar. Traditionally, on that day, peoples of the each village used to make a tour of their village lands. With the coming of the Christianity, they continue to do this, but they called the village of the parish, the area under the supervision of the one priest. Overworked peasants welcome holidays because they were not expected to work then. These days could mean for prayers, but people usually spend a good part of them having fun and fasting. Pilgrimage was an important part of a Christian's life, and many peoples went on the long journeys to shrine of matras or to big churches. A monk who travel to long distance. What is this? Palmers. What is palmers? Means a monk who travel to long distance is called palmers. When in April the sweet showers fall and the priests the drought of March to the root, and a small bird are making melody that sleep away the night with an open eye. So nature prick them and the heart engages. Then people long to go on pilgrimage. The palmers long to seek the foreign shrines of far off saints, rivers in various lands, and especially from every shrine of England and Canterbury they make their journey. Geoffrey Clochery in 1340 to 1400, the Canterbury Tales. This was written in the Middle English and verses in the translation in the modern English. The third order, peasants, free and unfree. Let us now turn to the vast majority of people, naming those who sustain and the first two orders. Cultivators were of two kinds, free peasants and the serfs, from the verb to serfs. Free peasants held their farms as tenants of the Lord. The men had to be rendered military service at least 40 days every year. Peasants' families had to set aside certain days of the week, usually 3 but often more. When they would go to the Lord's estate and work there, the output from the such labors, called the labor rents, could go directly to the Lord. In addition, they could be required to do other unpaid labor services like digging ditches, gathering firewood, building fences, and the repairing roads and buildings. Besides helping in the field, women and children had to do other tasks. They spun thread, woven cloth, made candles, and the pressed grapes to prepare wine for the land uses. There was one direct tax called tithe that kings sometimes imposed on the peasants. The clergy and the nobles were accepted from the paying this. Serfs cultivated plot of land, but this belonged to the lords. Much of the produce from this land was given to the lord. They also had to work on the land which belonged exclusively to the lord. They received no wages and could not leave the estate without the lord's permission. The lords claimed a number of monopolies at the expense of his serfs. Serfs could use only their lord mills to grind their flour, this oven to bake his bread, and his wine press to distill wine and beer. The lord could decide whom a serf could marry or might give his blessing to the serf's choice, but on payment of a fee. An English Plongland, 16th century. England. Feudalism developed in England from the 11th century, and the Angles and the Saxons from Central Europe had settled in the England in the 16th century. The country's name England is a variant of the England. In the 11th century, William, the Duke of the Normandy, crossed the English Channel with an army and defeated the Saxon king of England. From this time, France and England were often at war because of dispute over territory and trade. The present Queen of England is descended from the William I. William I had the land mapped and distributed it in section to the 1880 nomarch nobles who had migrated with them. The lords became the chief tenants of the king and were expected to give him military help. They were obliged to supply a certain number of knights to the king. They soon began to gift some of their own land to the knights who would serve them just as their turn served the king. They could not, however, use their knights for the private welfare, which was forbidden in England. Anglo-Saxon peasants became tenants of the various levels of landlords. Havre Castle, England, 13th century. Factors affecting social and economical relation. While members of the first two orders saw the social system as stable and unchanging, there were several processes which were transforming the system. Some of these, such as changes in the environment, were gradual and almost imperceptible. Others were the more dramatic, like the changes in the agriculture, technology, and the land use. This in turn to have shaped by and had an effect on the social and economical ties between the lords and the vassals. Let us examine this process one by one. The environment. From the 15th to the 10th century, most of Europe was covered with the vast forest. Thus, the land available for agriculture was limited. Also, peasants dissatisfied with their conditions could flee from the oppression and take refuge in the forest. Europe was undergoing an intensive cold climate spell in this period. This led to the prolonged winters, a strengthened growing season for crops, and reduced yield for agriculture. From the 11th century, Europe entered a warm phase. Average temperature increased, which has a profound effect on the agriculture. Peasants now had longer growing season and the soil are now less subjected to frost. Could be more easily pronged. Environmental historians have noticed that there was a significant receding of the forest line in the many parts of the Europe. This made expansion of the area under cultivation possible. Land use. Initially, agriculture technologies were very primitive. The only mechanical aid available to the peasants was the wooden plough, drawn by a team of oxen. This plough could at the best sketch the surface of the earth and was unable to fully draw out the nature of productivity of the soil. Agriculture was therefore very labor intensive. Fields had to be dug by hand, often once in the 4 year. Enormous manual labor was required. Also, an ineffective method of crop rotation was in use. The land was divided in half. One field was planted in autumn with winter wheat, while the other field was left fallow. Rye was planted on his piece of fallow land. The next year the other half was put to the fallow. With this system, the soil slowly deteriorated. The famine were not uncommon. Chronic malnutrition altered with the devastating famine, and the life was difficult for the poor. Despite this hardship, the lords were anxious to maximize their income. Since it was not possible to increase output from the land, the peasants were forced to bring under cultivation all the land in the manorial state. They spent more time doing this than they were legally bounded to do. The peasants did not bow quietly to the oppression, since they could not protest openly. They restored to passive resistance. They spent more time cultivating their own fields. They gave much of the product of that labor for themselves. They also avoided performing unpaid extra services. They came into conflict with the lords over pasture and forest land, and saw this land as resources to be used by whole community. While the lords treated this as their private property, new agriculture technology. By the 11th century, there is evidence of the several technological changes. Instance of the basic wooden plough. Cultivators began using heavy iron-tipped plough and mounded broads. This plough could dig much deeper and could mound broads, turn the topsoils, probably with the nutrients from the soil from better utilized. The method of harnessing animal to the plough improvised instead of the neck harnessing. The shoulder harness came into use with the enabled animals to exert greater power. Horses were now better shots with iron horses, which prevented foot decay. There was increased use of the wind and water energy for agriculture. More water powered with the wind power mills were set up all over the Europe for the purpose like mining, core and the pressing gaps. There were also changes in the land use. The most revolutionary one was that which from a 2-field to a 3-field system. In this, peasants could use a field 2 years out of the 3 if they planted it for one crops in autumn and the different crop in spring a year and a half later. That meant that farmer could break their holding into 3 fields. They could plant one with the wheat or yam in autumn for human consumption. The second could be used in the spring to rice, peas, beans and the lentils for human use, and oats were barley for the horses. The third field lay fallow. Each year they rotated the use among the 3 fields. With this improvement, there was almost immediate increase in the amount of food produced with each unit of land. Food availability doubled. The greater use of plants like peasants, beans and meant more vegetable proteins in the diet of the average Europeans and a better source of fodder for their animals. For cultivator, it meant better opportunities. They could now produce more food from less land. The average size of a peasant's farm shrank from about 100 acres to 20 to 30 acres by the 13th century. Holdings which were smaller could be more efficient cultivated and reduced the amount of labor needed. This gave the peasant time for the other activities. Some of these technological changes cost a lot of money. Peasants did not have enough money to set up water mills and windmills. Therefore, initiative was taken by the lords, but peasants were able to take the initiative in many things, such as extending arable land. They also switched to the 3-field rotation of the crop and set up a small forge and the smithies in the villages. Their iron-tipped plong and the horseshoes were made and repaired cheaply. From the 11th century, the person bounded that had been the basis of the feudalism were awakened, because economic transactions were becoming more and more money based. Lords found it convenient to ask for rent in the cash, not services, and cultivators were selling their crops for money instead of the exchanging them for other goods to traders, who would then take such goods to be sold in the towns. The increasing use of money began to influence prices, which became higher in the times of poor harvests. In England, for instance, agriculture prices doubled between 1270 and the 1320s. The fourth order, new town and townspeople. Expansion in agriculture was occupied by the growth in the third related areas: population, trade, and town. From roughly 42 million in 1000, Europe's population stood 62 million about 1200 and 73 million in 1300. Better food meant a longer lifespan. By the 13th century, an average European is expected to live 10 years longer in the 8th century. Women and girls have shorter lifespan compared to men because of later ate better food. The towns of the Roman Empire had become deserted and the ruin after its fall. But from the 11th century, as agriculture increased and became able to sustain higher level of population, towns began to grow again. Peasants who had surplus again to sell needs a place where they could set up a selling center and where they could buy tools and cloth. This led to the growth of the periodic fairs and the small marketing centers, which gradually developed towns like features a town square, a church, road where merchants built shops, and the homes and office where those who governed the towns could meet. In other places, towns grew around large castles, bishops' estates, or large churches. In towns, instead of the services, people paid a tax to the lords who owned the land on which the town stood. Towns offered the prospect of paid works and the freedom from the lord's control for young peoples from peasants' families. Town air makes free was a popular saying. Many serfs craving to be a free ran away from Hind to towns. In a serf could stay for 1 year and 1 day without his lord discovering him. He would become a free man. Many people in towns were free peasants or escaped serfs who provided unskilled labor. Shopkeepers and merchants were numerous. Later, there were needed for the individual with specialized skills like bankers and the lawyers. The bigger towns has population of about 30,000. They would be sent to have formed a fourth order. The basic of economic organization was the guild. Each craft or industries was organized into a guild, an association which controlled the quality of the product, its price and its sales. The guild hall was feature of every town. It was the building for the ceremony functions and were the head of all the guilds met formally. Guilds pastored and the town's walls, and the musicians were called to play at fest and in civic processions. The innkeepers looked after travelers. By the 11th century, new trade routes with the West Asia were developing. Scandinavian merchants, Scandinavian are the countries which is lie on the Scandinavian mountain, which is Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, were sailing south from the North Sea to exchange fur and hunting hogs for cloth. English traders came to sell tin in France by the 12th century. Commerce and the crafts began to grow. Early craftsmen used to travel from manor to manor. Now they found it easier to settle in one place where good could be produced and traded for food. As the number of towns grew, the trade continued to expand. Towns merchants became rich and powerful and rivals the power of nobility. Cathedral towns. One of the ways that rich merchants spent their money was by making donation to churches. From the 12th century, large churches called cathedrals were being built in the France. These belonged to the monasteries, but different groups of people contributed to the construction with their own labors, materials or money. Cathedrals were built of stone and took many years to complete. As they were being built, the area around the cathedrals became more populated, and when they were completed, they became centers of the pilgrimage. Thus, small towns developed around them. Cathedrals were designed so that the priest's voice could be heard clearly within the hall. Were large number of people gathered, and so that the singing of monk could sound beautiful, and the charming bells calling people to pray could be heard over a great distance. Stained glass was used for the windows. During the day, sunlight could make them radiant for the people inside the cathedral, and after sunset, the light of the candle could make them visible to the people outside. The sustainable glass windows narrated the stories in the Bible through pictures which illiterate people could read. Salisbury Cathedral, England. Because of the inadequacy which we often felt on the feast days, for a narrowness of the places forced the woman to run towards the altar upon the heads of the men, with much anguish and the noisy confusion. We decided to enlarge the amplify the noble church. We also caused to be painted by the acquisition land of the many masters from different regions. A splendid variety of the new windows, because these windows are very valuable on the accounts of other wonderful execution, and profuse expenditure of the painted glass and the furnished glasses. We appointed and the official mastermen craftsmen for their protection, and also a goldsmith who would receive their allowance, namely coin from the altar and flour from the common storehouse of the brethren, and who could never neglect their duty to look after this work. About Shurg. The crisis of the 14th century. But the early 14th century, Europe's economic expansion slowed down. This was due to the three factors. In the North Europe, by the end of the 13th century, the warm summers of the previous 300 had given way to Brittany the cold summers. Seasons for growing crops were reduced by month, and it became difficult to grow crops on the higher ground. Storms and the oceanic flood destroyed many farm sheds, which resulted in the less income in the taxes of the government. The opportunity offered by the favorable climate conditions before the 13th century had led to the large-scale reclamation of the land of the forest and the pastures of the agriculture. But inextensively plowing has exhausted the soil despite the practice of the 3 fields rotation of the crop. Because the clearance was not accompanied by proper soil conservation, the shortage of pasturage reduced the number of cattle. Population grown was the outstreaming resources, and the immediate result was the famine. Severe famine hit Europe between 1315 and 1317, followed in the 1320s by the massive cattle death. In addition, trade was hit by a several shortage of metal money because of shortfall in the output of the silver mines in the Austria and Siberia, Serbia, not Siberia, Serbia. This forced government to reduce the silver content of the currency and to mix it with the cheaper metal. The worst was yet to become. As trade expanded in the 13th century and the 14th centuries, ships carried goods from distant country and had started arriving in European ports. Along with the ships came rats, carrying the deadly bubonic plague infectious, the Black Death. Western Europe, relatively isolated in the early century, was hit by an epidemic between 1347 to 1350. The modern estimate to be mortality in the epidemic was 20% of the population of the whole Europe died, with some places losing as much as 40% of the population. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies had breakfast with their kinfolk and same night stipend with her ancestors in the next world. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickness by the thousands daily and dead unattended and without help. Many died in the open street, other dying in their houses. Many houses made it known by the snitch of the their rotting bodies. Concrete churchyards did not suffice for the burial of the vast mutilating of bodies, which were helped by the hundreds in the